Funnily enough, and I know this may be shocking to a lot of students, but I was actually in Orange 317. It was a Tuesday. I had a free period, the last period, because remember, the first plane hit right before 9 a.m., which would mean it would be right before 2 p.m. London time. And I was in my room. We didn't have MacBook Pros at that time. We had like the desktop and everything. And one of my US history students comes running in to the room and said, "Mr. Gladys, have you seen the news?"
So strangely, I was actually at band camp. I was at my university. I was in, it was my senior year of college, and we used to go to Wisconsin for band camp. So we're actually in kind of like a remote, rural area of America. And I remember specifically learning about the events of 9/11 from radio in a big truck because we didn't have any televisions or anything.
I was living in New York and working in Manhattan at the time, and it was a Tuesday morning. I went to work and arrived maybe roughly at 8 a.m. So I was working in Midtown, not too far from Central Park, and I remember seeing some of the maintenance staff. I overheard them speaking in Spanish, but I understood Spanish, and I don't think they realized that I could understand what they were saying, but something about an airplane and a building. And when I got to my office, everybody in my office was kind of buzzing about it, but still fairly quiet. And, we managed to pull a TV into the office and, sort of checking out the news. And the first plane had just hit the World Trade Center, and we thought it was clearly an accident. Clearly someone had gone off course. Clearly it was just this freak occurrence that had happened until the second plane hit. And I was getting phone calls from my friends checking up on me. My mother at the time, before she retired, worked at the World Trade Center about a block away, or around the corner. So my good friends who knew where my mother was, they were calling, and I was confused.
I was in my third year of teaching, and I was with another teacher, and we were on our way to a professional development opportunity, and we were driving like 45 minutes away. When we got there, we were told what was happening, and her name was Pat, and she had a daughter who was in New York City at that time, so she was very concerned about her daughter, who would have been right in that area, but you couldn't get through on phone lines, or there was no communication open, so she couldn't find out what was going on. I was wanting to help her in any way that I could. I was like, we could drive there, what can we do? At the same time, my dad was a Marine. He's retired now for 30 years, and that was the year of his retirement. In fact, his retirement party was a week after that, so I immediately thought of what this meant for the US, what it meant for military personnel, what it meant for my father. So I called my dad, and I couldn't get through for a while because he was actually busy calling to see if he could not retire, so that he could help in any way that he possibly could, whatever that might mean. So he was wanting to continue serving and not retire as a Marine.
Mostly shock, surprise, worry. I grew up in northern New Jersey. I have a lot of friends who live in Manhattan or just across the river in Hoboken and that area, and so I was concerned for a lot of them and trying to message them and talk or call them. When people look back on this event, it's also kind of thought of as a big national moment, and I don't remember having those feelings initially. I think those feelings may have come later, but initially it was more about kind of the shock, the surprise.
on CNN, and obviously I see the scenes of the first plane had already hit the North Tower, and I couldn't believe it. My phone rings, one of those lovely Nokia bricks, and it's my wife, because my wife had just, funnily enough, moved back from New York City, and she wasn't my wife at that point in time. She was my fiance, and she had just moved back, and she actually worked on Wall Street right by the World Trade Center, which kind of freaked her out because a lot of her coworkers were obviously in her office at that point in time. And my mother-in-law was a United flight attendant, and she had just landed in London that morning at 6 a.m. and she was actually back at our house because she would stay with us when she flew back and forth from San Francisco to London.
And I also remember it being very scary because I had friends in the band who had parents and family who lived in New York. And while this was a time when some people had cell phones, not a lot of people did, and they weren't working. And so we were just sort of isolated in this part of Wisconsin trying to figure out what was going on in the world. And I remember it being very scary. I also remember that later, it was either that night or the next day, we watched sort of a live feed. They got us a television, and we were able to see the President of the United States, who at the time was George W. Bush, addressing the nation and sort of helping people process what was going on. And I remember feeling that desperation for leadership at that time, and I think that was kind of an interesting thing. That was the first moment of my life, and I would have been about 21 years old, where I really strongly felt the need for like a leader in America to help us understand or process what was going on.
Because it was playing on a loop, I think what I remember from that period of time the most is that it's when I formed a relationship with the media that I began to realize I could only take so much. For the right or wrong of it, it was days of just endlessly watching the planes hit the towers over and over and over again on a loop. And it took me several days of just being in this very catatonic place, not knowing what was going to happen with my father, with the US, with everyone's loved ones and such, but also realizing that was having a numbing effect on me and putting me in a place that I had never really been before.
New Yorkers really pulled together in a way that I had never seen, and I think Americans pull together. The way that people, sorry, that's okay. I don't think I've cried about it in a few years, but the way that people volunteered, they ran towards the Trade Center, they took people in. I mean, it was tremendous. New York really did me proud, did all of us proud. Because there were no differences at that point. We were just all New Yorkers, and we were all grieving. And then, of course, people in Washington, D.C. were grieving, and Pennsylvania were grieving, and America. It's taken me years to not feel such a sense of grief every year on the anniversary. I can't believe it's been 20 years and now people are looking at it as though it's history, but I lived it and I was there, and thankfully my mother was okay, and I didn't lose anyone, but anyway, it's desperately sad still. It's just a terrible, terrible, terrible chapter in our history.